Hi, and welcome back to chapter 7 of the book of Esther. I'm so glad you're joining me. There are only 10 short chapters in this book, and we've kind of been on this journey together. I hope that you are learning things and applying them just as I'm doing the same thing as I study to teach it each week. But you remember when we left off last week in chapter 6, Ahasuerus had a sleepless night, and we said he had so many distractions he could have called upon to tire himself out and fall back off to sleep, but he called for a book, and it was a book of Chronicles. It was a book of remembrance. And you might recall that we talked about God has a book of remembrance too. We went to Malachi 3 for that. And he's writing down everything too. The book of Chronicles that Ahasuerus, the king, had just was the history, everything that had happened, who had done what had been said and done, and for good or bad, it was all written there. And so we called for this book of remembrance. Interestingly, though, everything, we see the providence of God. There's just evidence everywhere of that, because he called for a book. Number one, the chamberlain who went to get the book brought a particular book. It could have come from probably a whole room full of books. So just go into the room and just reach on a shelf and pull out one book. And it was exactly the book that would play such a major part in what happens from that point on. So he pulled a particular book, and when the king received it, he just opened the book to a particular page and began to read. None of that is coincidental. God was there all along orchestrating that. And so as he read in that book, he realized that Mordecai, Esther's cousin who had raised her, had saved his life 2 years ago. Some people say as many as 5 years had gone by. I don't know that it's quite that long, but at least 2 years had gone by. So quite some time. Nothing was ever done. We said it's never too late to send a thank you note, right? And so he wants to know how he can honor Mordecai for having saved his life. Mordecai had heard of a plot to overthrow the king, and he had sent word to the king. And so it saved the king's life. He thought, what could I do to Mordecai for his goodness, kindness to me? And so about that time, it had to be the nighttime, I'm thinking, when Haman arrived. He had gone home, you recall, to talk to his supposed wise advisors and his wife Zeresh, and they said, I tell you what we need to do with that Mordecai who's not bowing to you every time you walk into the palace to see the king. What we should do is just build a gallows for him and hang him on it. And they built it. It was the equivalent of 75 feet high. That meant that the whole city would see Mordecai being hanged for his supposed crime. Anyway, so Haman had gone to the castle, same time that Esther is there, same time that the book has been brought and the page has been read about Mordecai saving his life. So when the king realized that Haman was in the court, he said, send him on in. And he said, before Haman had time to say anything, he said, what should be done? The king said to Haman, what should be done for the man whom I choose to honor? I wish to honor. And Haman, thinking that the king wanted to honor him, said, oh, his robe, the king's robe, your robe should be given to this man, and your horse, and he should be ridden through the town streets, and everybody could see that he's been promoted. And the king, in that twist of fate for Haman, said, yes, do that to Mordecai. So interesting, yes. So Haman, who hoped to hang Mordecai on the gallows, had to actually lead the parade through town, promoting him and claiming his goodness. So interesting. But anyway, we said that Mordecai and Haman are going to get their just rewards. You reap what you sow. It's a law of God. That sowing and reaping, it's a law. And some laws just can't be changed. I'll give you an example of that. Let's suppose that if we wanted to change the law of gravity, could we do that? We could not. I can pick up these papers. If I were to drop them, they are not going this way. If I pick up these papers, they are going down, because that is a law. It's the law of gravity. Well, the law of sowing and reaping is God's law, and it's the same way. We sow whatever we have reaped. But in chapter 7, verses 1 through 4, it says this. We'll just read a few verses at a time, like we've been doing. So the king and Haman came to banquet with Esther, the queen. Remember, she had planned the first banquet, knowing all along that Haman was the enemy, but she didn't say anything. So she said, would you come the next day to another banquet of wine? And so this is where this picks up. So the king and Haman came to banquet with Esther, the queen. And the king said again unto Esther on the second day, at the banquet of wine, what is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed, even to the half of the kingdom. We said that we weren't sure that he would give her literally half of the kingdom, but what that meant is whatever you want, Esther, you can have. And so what is thy request? It shall be performed, even to half the kingdom. Then Esther, the queen, answered and said, if I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. It had already gone out. The decree had already gone out, and the king had signed it. We'll talk about that toward the end. So this second banquet, second day, the king repeats his question, what do you want? I'll give you anything you want. Up to half the kingdom, you can have it. But she approaches him with such poise and respect for his position. She says, if I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king. And then she goes on to say, let my life be given me at my petition and my people at my request. So even when she's making her final request, and she has an idea, I think, how it's going to escalate this whole scene, how it's going to play out, but she's still just so gracious. We don't know if she was just naturally gracious or had diplomacy, if she had just been trained that way, but she approached the king in respect of his position. I'm thoughtful all the time of Proverbs chapter 11, verse 16, a gracious woman retaineth honor. You know, there's so many times when we might like to say or do something, but if we can just allow the Lord to handle that, it's a little bit easier to remain whatever honor or testimony we might have already. But I'm keeping in mind that Esther is the wife of the king. So this formality that she has, typically you don't see that between spouses for sure. We just run into our spouse and pour our heart out, right? If we have something on our mind. But Esther didn't forget his position. I was reminded when I was studying this, and I thought of it so often as a pastor's wife, I reminded myself, it was always right in the forefront of my mind, I'm married to a man of God, and that position requires respect. So even as his wife, there was a line I knew I dared not cross. And I think if you talk to most pastors' wives, they would say the same thing. Preachers' wives, even if they're not a pastor's wife, they know not to touch God's anointed. And so there's a line they don't cross. Even if you're upset with your husband, you can't do that. And so it keeps a level of respect in the relationship, which is needful for a great marriage, I will say. Esther showed wisdom in how she presented her request. She appealed to him on a personal basis, but still did it with that poise. And I think this too, Esther knew she had never done anything but please him. And so he would expect her to come to him at that level, I'm sure. But verse 5 goes on to say, then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, who is he and where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so? That's the king's reaction right there. Who is this man? Where is he? How dare he think he's going to do this? Did he not know? Did he not remember that he was the one who had put that plan in motion or authorized it after Haman had put that plan in motion? It's curious to me about this two-way street on this in teaching school. I've always been intrigued that some students don't understand that cheating goes both ways. They think you're only cheating if you look on somebody else's paper and copy the answers. However, if you allow them to do that or give them your paper, you are party to that. Anyway, it's a two-way street, and this thing with the king and Haman had been a two-way street. We know that. He obviously signed the decree. That's how the decree was able to go out. Did he think it was just another day, just another dollar in the government office of the king? We're not sure. Or it may be like the auto pen. Who knows? Or I'm sure he signed it personally, but just document after document, crossing over your desk, sign it. What does it say? Okay, here we go. Maybe it was just routine and he didn't really read it or pay really close attention, but for whatever reason, we said, as soon as that decree had been signed in the other chapter, it says that he and Haman and he, I think maybe Haman instigated that. It's just my own personal thought. They went out and sat down to drink is the terminology. So maybe had dinner or maybe just had drinks or whatever it was after the decree had been signed. And why would they do that? Why would they just immediately sign that? They have just signed away the annihilation of the Jews. And as if it's nothing, like, wash your hands of it, let's go eat. What in the world? But somehow the king is surprised at this moment in chapter 7. I think maybe Haman suggested going to sit down to drinks because he was afraid the king would realize what he had done, maybe. I'm not sure. But in verse 6 it says this, and Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and queen. The adversary and the enemy is this wicked Haman. This meek, quiet lady has some righteous indignation in verse 6. I'm reminded in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26, it says, be ye angry and sin not. There are some things to be angry about. Esther no longer felt the need to be meek and mild, meek and quiet. She just called Haman out. And the king's wrath was immediate. I think she waited. She had the first banquet, then she didn't say anything. Then she had this second banquet, and we wonder, why would she do that? Why would she not just tell what the problem was? I think maybe the delay maximized the impact for both Haman and the king. I think both of them felt that. Never underestimate the influence of a woman. She knew what she was doing, and God probably had prompted her to behave that way as far as the time sequence goes. But think about all the women in the Bible. We women influence for good or for bad. We are an influence, and that's documented everywhere. I think I've mentioned to you before, in those fighter jets, a lot of times they're listening to a woman's voice that's instructing them, because they say a man responds to a woman's voice more than any other voice in the universe or any other sound in the universe. It's interesting. Never underestimate the influence of a woman. Think about the women in the Bible who had influence. We'll say for bad, we'll name Jezebel, remember? Wanted to kill Elijah. He despaired enough that he wanted to die. Yeah, the influence of a woman. He had just slain 450 prophets of Baal, and one woman had him running for his life. But think about some other women who carried great influence. What about Eve, the mother of all living? For sure she did. Adam was not deceived. The devil got Eve, and she got Adam. What about Sarah? Yeah, the mother of the tribes of Israel. Deborah, Barak wouldn't even go to war without her. Miriam, Moses' sister, who led the women of Israel in song and timbrels and things like that over victories. Jael. Now she's a character. Remember, she just kind of joined in with the military, put a tent peg through his skull for military advancement of Israel. What about Tamar? We don't think too highly of some of the ways she did things, but Jesus came from the tribe of Judah, so Tamar played a part in that, and she's in Matthew 1 in the genealogy of Jesus. Then there's Rahab, who is also in the genealogy. Abigail, she was such a soothing voice to the future King David that he didn't take revenge like he had planned. There's Bathsheba. Even at the end of David's life, Bathsheba and David were jam up jelly tight, as we say. They were just still tight after all those years. And we can't overlook Mary, the mother of Jesus, can we? Such influence. We're still influenced today by that story. But I want you to think about, let's see, it's 1 Peter chapter 3, yes. 1 Peter chapter 3 says this, talking about a woman and her role. Likewise, you wives, be in subjection. A lot of women don't like that. To your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they also may without the word be won by the conversation or the conduct of the wives, while they behold your chaste conversation coupled with fear, whose adorning let it not be that outward adorning of plaiting the hair and of wearing of gold, or of putting on of apparel. Some people say, I've heard some people take that verse to say, oh, you shouldn't wear any jewelry, you shouldn't wear any makeup. But if you're going to apply that, it also says, or putting on apparel, and you definitely need to wear clothes. Just saying. Okay, verse 4 of that says, but let it be the hidden man of the heart, and that which is not corruptible, even the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit. I love that analogy of an ornament, which is in the sight of God of great price. For after this manner in the old time the holy women also who trusted in God adorned themselves, being in subjection unto their own husbands, even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters ye are, as long as ye do well, and are not afraid with any amazement. And so we just see that influence of a woman right there, whose daughters you are, were spiritual descendants of Sarah. As long as you do well, it said, and that would just involve righteous conduct, doing good, even when it's difficult to do that. Are not afraid with any amazement. Just means not overcome by fear and panic, not living in fear and panic all of the time. So the idea is not to be a wallflower, where it says a meek and quiet spirit is in the sight of God of great price. It doesn't mean just fade into the background. The women we've just named stepped forward and had influence, and God intended for women to carry their influence for good. So not to be a wallflower. What it means is don't be worked up all the time. Have you ever seen any women, and every time you see them, they are worked up about something? If we're saying start at a 1 and then go up if you have to get things done, as far as elevating your insistence, we'll say, or persistence. But so many women start out at an 11 instead of a 1. So the idea is just not to be worked up all the time. In verses 7 and 8, back in Esther, it says, and the king arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath. We said he was immediately angry. He went into the palace garden, and Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. All of a sudden, Haman realizes this is not going to end well for him. And so the king stands up and he walks out into the garden, leaving Haman and Esther still in the room. I'm thinking there had to be some type of guard somewhere close by, but for however it played out. Verse 8 says, then the king returned. So he walked back into the room from the garden. Then the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine. And Haman was fallen upon the bed whereon Esther was. Then said the king, will he force the queen also before me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. You know, this Haman, he shows no discretion in anything he does at all. No common sense. What does he think he's doing? You know, in these days, and even in New Testament days, it was like a couch that you kind of lounged on instead of like chairs with backs like we sit in right now. But Haman fell upon the couch, like leaned forward toward Esther as she is on the couch. What was he thinking? One writer that I saw somewhere, it was a Jewish historian, Jewish writer. It wasn't Josephus. But this Jewish writer said that Gabriel pushed Haman onto the couch. I don't know that that's true. Gabriel usually delivered good messages, but he did deliver a few bad messages. But whether or not he would push Haman onto the couch, I don't know about that. But at any rate, the king walks back in, and Haman has leaned over toward Esther. And so then that's when the king says, will he force the queen also before me in my own house? What is he doing? And as soon as the king said that, I think this is evidence there were chamberlains in the room or guards of some sort. It says, and they covered Haman's face. So they, whoever they are, were in the room. But covering Haman's face was just indication that there would be execution, because you've seen it before, like I have in the movies or whatever. They put the black thing over their head, and you know this can't end well at all. So Haman was caught in his own trap. The chapter ends, verses 9 and 10, and Harbana, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, so 50 cubits, that's equal to 75 feet, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him thereon. Yeah, so it's just been flipped on him, and Haman has been caught in his own trap. The reference that I'm reminded of Haman when I read it in Psalm chapter 7, verses 14 through 16. Listen and see if this doesn't sound like Haman. Behold, he travaileth with iniquity, and has conceived mischief, and brought forth falsehood. He made a pit, and digged it, and has fallen into the ditch which he made. His mischief shall return upon his own head, and his violent dealing shall come down upon his own pate. Doesn't that just sound like exactly what just happened to Haman? So caught in his own trap. God often works this way. If you read Proverbs, you kind of see that indication there too in several verses. Perhaps the greatest example of this, being caught in your own trap, was when Satan thought he had won by getting the crowd to crucify Jesus, because the cross turned out to be the utter demise and defeat of Satan. Did he not see that coming? So the Bible says, so they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. That's how Esther 7 ends. The king's wrath was pacified, was satisfied. And I couldn't help but note, in the case of Mordecai and Haman, the guilty died in place of the innocent. But in the case of Jesus and us, it was the innocent dying in place of the guilty. Anyway, so many thoughts from Esther chapter 7 for what we should be doing and what we shouldn't be doing. But isn't it wonderful that the Lord has given us these Old Testament stories? We learn so much from them. I had started to combine chapters 7 and 8 because they're kind of short, but there was just too much to unwrap in chapter 7. So the law of sowing and reaping, we'll remember that. We get our just rewards. Whatever we sow, that we will also reap. Another takeaway from chapter 7 is just to maintain our poise and the way we present ourselves as women. God made us to be women to accomplish certain things. And this is another case of be sure your sin will find you out, which is what happened to Mordecai for sure there. And it's okay to have righteous indignation. Yeah. But that same verse in Ephesians 4 we were talking about, it does go on to say, let not the sun go down upon your wrath. So even things that we get upset about that may not be righteous, we have to get it right that day. You can't let it hang on there at all. And so anyway, I hope you got some takeaways from the lesson today, and I hope you'll join me next week for chapter 8. Let's have a word of prayer. Lord, thank you again for this opportunity to study your word and for the lessons that we've gleaned from Esther chapter 7. Help us to apply it to our own lives, Lord, and to serve you better. And we'll thank you. Bless each person who's taken time to listen. We'll be grateful for that. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. I'll see you next week.